Chapter 8. Alexander 8, March 10th, 5,337,841,067 BC through July 5th, 1,164,034,338 BC. It had been over 8 billion years, and the universe had billowed out across the increasing expanse at an unbelievable rate. Something strange was happening. Just as Alexander had, at the beginning of time, been unsure as to whether or not he was shrinking or the universe was growing around him, so too could it now be said of the distancing galaxies. It seemed that they were moving away from one another so as to create proportional distances between them relative to their positions. Yet, they were not themselves moving at speeds that could create such voids between them. Space itself was expanding between them. As time went on, the expansion slowly began to gain momentum, and the galaxies went from slowly drifting apart to rapidly accelerating away, and the rate of expansion only became faster and faster with the passage of time. Alexander was still very much without thought at the time, and did not ponder what unseen dark energy supplied this energy. He gave no thought to anything. He simply was. Theories to suggest an explanation to the phenomenon would feature heavily in his later teachings, but as he bore witness to it, he thought of nothing. He simply was. He had forgotten what it meant to be alone, yet he was alone still. Then, in the outer wing of a spiral galaxy from nowhere came life. Alexander could feel its collective, unwitting strife to overcome the tumultuous climb to securing and prolonging their existence, their unfelt hunger for energy sources. Curious, Alexander moved in the direction of the feeling, wary not to move so swiftly as he desired, lest he wind up frozen in time again. Something deep inside of him must have remembered the consequences of extreme velocity, for he feared the trap of time. The laws of physics were in charge always, and this time he would submit to their rule. He had been a worthy challenger, but he'd lost in the end. He would never again attempt to dominate over universal law. He would not go faster than the speed of light. Even at the amazing speed at which he traversed intergalactic space, it would take him billions of years to reach the life-bearing planet, and he watched it evolve at an accelerated rate as he moved toward it with such incredible speed. It seemed from his perspective that the natural processes of everything were speeding up in front of him. Funny things happened to the progression of time when accelerating at high speeds. Amazingly, once he'd accelerated to the top speed he could achieve, because his experience of time had been slowed down so much, the rapid speed at which he'd observed the evolution of life suddenly was not so rapid. He and the planet were now two bodies adrift in space with constant motion and velocity, both arguably at rest relative to every other body. He could argue that the universe was moving past him and he was at rest, because he no longer felt the force of acceleration. He was then not moving and yet moving, just the same as every other object traveling in a fixed trajectory at a fixed speed. The observed effects of time dilation were no longer creating the illusion of rapid time progression, but rather slowed time progression for all that which he observed save for himself. He felt as though time was progressing at a normal 1 minute to 1 minute ratio with regard to his own being, just as he always had. Alexander would explain in his teachings why this phenomenon occurs, how non-interacting objects are in a constant state of equivalence, and how it creates unique perspectives of the progression of time for every individual object, complicated further by the gravitational mass of the object in question and other derivative forces experienced in the vicinity of the object. He called it the Great Dance. His timing was all well and good, though. He had not yet missed the first thoughts of the forthcoming sentient species that would grace this strange watery world, and he was glad as he did not want to miss such a great milestone. He was grateful for the slowed rate of progression he'd experienced after his speed had leveled off. He didn't want life to have come and gone before he'd arrived to greet its intelligent progeny. By the time he finally reached the vicinity of the planet and slowed his speed, several extinction-level events had already occurred, but none involving any higher life forms than one might find stuck to the bottom of their shoe after trekking through the mud. As he descended through the atmosphere with no resistance, He looked around at the great oceans and land masses. There were great sheets of ice along the tilted poles of its axis that glistened where the starlight struck. On his journey, he had noticed that several other worlds in this part of the galaxy were also undergoing the same transformation. It seemed that wherever the conditions for life were present, life would spontaneously form, as if it were simply meant to be. It only makes sense, really. A universe barren of life is the art of a blind painter, never to be seen and never to be known. A universe without life serves no purpose, its many splendors then never to be experienced. Alexander had no need to directly involve himself, as he could serve as benefactor to the swelling life with the use of only his mind. So he stood motionless on the shores where he'd first come aground, the water lapping his feet. By the time he'd arrived, the fledgling life forms had mastered the utilization of the energy contained in the oxygen molecule. In the billions of years since the dawn of the sludge of early single-celled anaerobic life, a resourceful evolutionary tool had taken hold. Some of the early bacteria had evolved to harness the energy of the sun, and combined with the prevalent carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, produced the sugar they used for energy and also a toxic byproduct, the oxygen molecule. The blanketing of oxygen the world over meant certain death for much of the early life who could not adapt to live in peace with this explosively powerful atmospheric mixture. Thus, the production of oxygen itself caused one of the worst mass extinction in history, as it did on every planet undergoing the same process. Remarkably, the same process was happening simultaneously on several other worlds. It seemed that any hospitable planet tilted enough on its axis sufficiently to create seasonal temperature changes, residing within the habitable zone of its star and with a powerful enough magnetic field to maintain an atmosphere and liquid water, invariably produced life. Several of these worlds went on to house oxygen-producing, photosynthesizing creatures like the cyanobacteria of this and many other worlds. It must have been that the groundwork for this pattern had been encoded in the matter somehow. It seemed that it was simply meant to be. The once lifeless composite materials of creation had assembled into something on the verge of consciousness. The universe itself was becoming aware, vicariously through the life forms it had birthed. Hope had arrived for the struggling life here. Alexander had chosen this world for his own, and he would foster life here until it thrived and beyond. He could envision it. Then he would not be alone. As the light from the bright white star at the center of the solar system faded below the horizon, Alexander looked at the beauty of this world's night sky and saw its two moons, both small, one much more distant than the other, traversing the heavens across the belt of stars. One of those stars, one a mere 6,500 light years away, would one day become recognizable as the sun of the Earth. Alexander did not remember that he came from Earth, however, and he decided that this world, the one underfoot, would be his home. The people of the world would one day come to call it Tawala, and to call Alexander by another name. As he scanned the geologic and atmospheric activity around him, lava flows in the distance, the thunderous cracking of Tawala's growing paints rumbling from all around, the ground unsteady beneath his feet, lightning flashing all around under swirls of dark clouds, he began to smile. He was home. Lyelin 12.8, March 28, 2311 AD. The lives and work of Dr. Foster and Hannah Dunn were very celebrated, as they were the only two to have ever befriended Daniel Dwyer in life. They both had holidays dedicated to them, commemorating the dates of their births, and their stories were well known to school children the world over. If the Doctor and Hannah had met sooner in life, history could have played out much differently, but as it was, everything came together as it did. In retrospect, the notion of free will is irrelevant, as the past is immutable and cannot be changed even by a change in its telling. The past only happens once, so it follows that the future happens only once. There is no free will in the sense that today is the yesterday of tomorrow, and one can't change tomorrow the events of today any more than one can change the events of yesterday today. The past cannot be changed, and the present is the past of the future. Only for Lyelin this was not the case. Lyelin could change the future by making changes in the present, and view the futures wrought by various changes without even having to make them, allowing her to decide which of the many possible futures of the seemingly endless possible timelines comes to fruition. Therefore, it could be argued that she alone had free will, and that all else were simply her puppets, living out the fates she'd assigned them. She had the power to topple castles before ever their first brick was laid, and to give rise to the rulers of her choice the world over. She despised this entity, this demon that had come to finally be Daniel Dwyer. She had been hell-bent on staving off his birth ever since she'd first called him into existence with an act that could not be undone, the past being immutable as it was. She hated the fact that the only way to subdue him was to build this world that adored him, but relished in the fact that she could take it from him. She felt no guilt in doing so. For, by forcing her hand to create this and only this future, the bloodline of the people of her future, the one where she would have lived in peace with her Hemhut and the people of the earth, they were all gone. All of these people were decidedly strangers to her, despite having knowledge of their every movement. They were his people, not hers. Not a single one of the people of her world, of the world that had once adored her, remained. She had changed so much by creating this future, this abomination, that the lineage of mankind no longer yielded the population that would have once been. Her good and kindly people, the ones she cared for, nurtured, and forgave, they were gone. Daniel had stolen them away from her. Now she would return the favor. If she had allowed any other version of events to come to pass, the demon of so many names, decidedly now Daniel Dwyer, would have come for her and her people. So she did what she had to do. She protected her people by letting them live only in the memory of a future that once was, but that could be no more, despite that doing so shattered her heart. She would use him against his people, and the technology of his people against him. She had held him back for as long as she could, and had arranged for his defeat in advance of his arrival, and he had no idea. As far as he was concerned, she was his friend Emma Carter, and for the moment, she was. Nothing would remain of the area by day's end but a blood-soaked pile of rubble, and only Lylin, in her newly acquired vessel, would walk away from it and wholly unscathed. She had been planning this day forever, it seemed, and it was finally here. Between lives, even as her unknowing vessels lived, she remained adrift, free of awareness in the plane of death. Yet she owned time in such a sense that the events of her plan were imbued with her spirit. So, in a way, she was never dead, but only ever waiting. There was no part of Emma Carter that which Emma Carter was privy to that would have indicated in any way that she was in any way anyone other than Emma Carter, but she was. Deep inside of her mind, Lylin waited to consume her. She was the 12th reincarnation of Lylin, just not yet herself. There was no sign of Hemhut, just as there should not have been. His love bid him not to reveal himself, so hidden he remained, deep in the bowels of the planet, condemned to only listen. He had listened to her become the new Lylin decades ago when little Emma Carter matured, had heard the change in her voice as it had been with all of the others, but had to love her from afar, however much it hurt him to refrain from going to her, especially knowing that he could cure her blindness if he could only touch her. What broke him most was that his love was not his love. He had not come to awaken her as he always had, and so she remained asleep, just under the surface, awaiting another to lift the veil. He hated Daniel Dwyer, the one that had taken their peace from them, the one that had made him alone, the one hated by the one he loved. He stewed in his pit at the center of the earth, seething with hate for this creature he'd never laid eyes on, forced to listen to his damned people sing his praise and worship him as a god. He writhed, remembering that which Lylin had told him, that he would emerge only to find her dead or dying, having finally defeated their nemesis. His love had bid him tunnel downward until he could go no farther down, until, should he tunnel farther, he would be tunneling upward in any direction. So he'd long ago made his way to the center of the planet, begrudging Daniel Dwyer all the while. His love had bid him remain in hiding, so hidden he'd remained, amid the crushing noise of the churning core. His love had also bid him refrain from interfering and make no contact with the demon. He gave her his promise. From the untold depths he listened. It was today. She would be coming today. He waited, alone. The next stop in the museum tour was in front of the small exhibit that housed relics from the estate of Dr. Patrick Foster, where Daniel had spent the greater part of his life. There were selected outfits from their wardrobes displayed on mannequins, large photographs of the exterior of the house itself as it was during the time period, and forgeries of Dr. Foster's original handwritten notes documenting his experience with Daniel Dwyer, among so much more. It seemed kind of cramped next to the other more spread out exhibits. Among the relics, the one that seemed the most out of place was a pacifier. There was also a controversy about it, so it was usually the most discussed item in the case. Daniel Dwyer had inexplicably acquired it in the night, and Dr. Foster had discovered it the following morning, bagged and tagged it, and documented the date. It was the one and only time that Daniel had brought anything foreign into the household of his own volition, ever, and would be the only time in history he would do so. As I'm sure you well know, the origin of the infamous pacifier is a mystery, the curator said. Though many speculate that it could have belonged to Nathaniel Reddington, the evidence is circumstantial at best. While it is true that the date of the appearance of the pacifier does correspond with Reddington's youth, there is no proof that it was ever in his possession. By the time historians were permitted access to acquire a DNA sample from the pacifier in the late 21st century, it was no longer viable. Too much time had passed and it had been contaminated. There is no confirmed evidence that it comes from any specific individual, Nathaniel Reddington or otherwise. Emma said, except it did. The curator gave her a knowing nod and a quick flash of a salutatory smile. Rosa scanned all of the artifacts one at a time, stopping to look at the pacifier a while longer than some of the others, but then found herself fixated on another infamous piece, the last known photograph of the trio together, Dr. Patrick Foster, Daniel Dwyer, and Hannah Dunn, posing as if it were a family photo. Of all the people cast in movies and shows in the role of Hannah Dunn over the centuries, all stunning in their own right, none held a candle to the original. She was in her 70s in the photo, yet she could still draw the eye like a cloud over the sun. Dr. Foster didn't look bad for his age either. He'd have been in his late 50s at the time of the photo. Then there was Daniel, smiling a much-managed smile, gazing off into the distance with his signature blank stare, looking past the camera, his 8-ball in hand. He was turning 49 years old in the photo and had a little birthday hat strapped to his head. There was a slice of cake in front of him on the table. The doctor and Hannah looked very happy. They had no inclination at the time the picture was taken that anything foul was afoot, no notion at all of the forthcoming series of events that would end with all three of them dead. The museum is home to many genuine artifacts related to Nathaniel Reddington, the curator went on, all of which have been authenticated. Although the pacifier remains a curiosity to this day, in the end its origin again remains speculative. What about in the movie Mr. 8? Rosa said. Is that not what really happened? In the movie Mr. 8, then on its fourth remake and modernization, it is usually depicted that Daniel Dwyer comes to baby Nathaniel Reddington's rescue, and the child rewards him by offering him his binky, an infant's most prized possession. In the second remake, it was suggested that the pacifier was taken from the child because it was covered in blood, and Daniel didn't want the child to suck on the bloody pacifier. That was a stretch. Nevertheless, all that was known for certain is that on the morning of December the 26th, 2024, a pacifier appeared in the always empty trash bin in Daniel's room. It was the first time that Daniel had ever thrown anything away without having to be instructed to do so. Left to his own devices, he would place empty containers and any other refuse he produced right back where he had gotten them from. That was one of the things Dr. Foster could never integrate successfully into Daniel's routine. He would never throw anything in the garbage can unless he was explicitly instructed to do so. It was just something he did. Dr. Foster had often discovered empty bags and boxes in his cupboards and refrigerator. Yet, a pacifier had been discovered as the one and only item in the little waste bin in his room that morning. That is all that is known to historians. Anyone claiming to have knowledge of the events that led up to the appearance of the pacifier in Daniel's wastebasket is selling something they don't have. It was not seen by the cameras. Speculation about the mysterious events of Daniel Dwyer's life made for great storytelling, but that's all they were, stories. It seemed likely that the pacifier would belong to Nathaniel Reddington simply because of the circumstantial evidence, but since Daniel himself did not know, and there were no living witnesses, there was truly no way of knowing. Unfortunately, it is the way of the world. Some moments are simply lost to history. Some stories are simply never told.